Good morning. Um, Today I'm going to talk to you about researching crisis networks, and more specifically I want to address the question why you should care about this. We're surrounded by crises, be it incidents with a natural origin, such as an earthquake or a volcanic eruption causing a humanitarian catastrophe, a global pandemic threatening millions of lives across the globe. Or perhaps we could think about incidents with a man-made origin. For example, we can think about the consequences of global warming or the current situation in Ukraine. No matter what their origin is, crises are defined as threats endangering the survival of a system that require quick decision-making in conditions of uncertainty. Indeed, policymakers have to make decisions in no time without really knowing what the consequences of such decisions will be. Crises are also very politically salient moments. When they are in motion, it's quite hard to talk about something else. I'm sure you all remember when we were all locked down at home during COVID-19, what our conversations were about. And at that same time, our political leaders were struggling to decide the extent to which they had to prioritize the well-being of the economy of their countries over millions of lives of citizens living in their countries. And at the same time, we're living in a new era with its own set of challenges that affect the way we're managing crises. We're living in an ever more interdependent and globalized world that makes us more vulnerable to crises originating on the other side of the globe. But this is also the era of information technology, the internet, the social media, where we have a multiplicity of sources of information. And it's indeed hard to know at the moment whether the information that we're getting, all the input we're getting, is always accurate. I'm sure you're all familiar with one person that has published information of questionable accuracy, for example, on the consequences of vaccines and COVID-19 in human bodies. So what can we do in this situation when we don't know what's right, what's wrong, what's true, what's false? Well, in this presentation, I'm going to argue that academic research is a very powerful tool to address these challenges. And I'm going to talk to you about a very specific kind of research, that on crisis networks. Now, I've defined the idea of crises, but I haven't talked to you about the idea of networks yet. Think about this image. This will illustrate the idea of a network. Networks are structures which are comprised of two elements. The first of which is actors, which are here represented in circles numbered from 1 to 4. The second elements are the connections among these actors. So this network could represent financial transfers among individuals, or perhaps communication among different actors for the sake of managing a crisis. What networks do is putting the actions of, for example, particular organizations in a wider context, how these organizations operate in a wider system. If we think about the World Health Organization during the Ebola outbreak, if we think about a network, we will not only focus on what it did or what it did not do, but on who the WHO was coordinating with, who the WHO was contacting during this pandemic, which can also give us key information as to why this pandemic was well or not well managed. Now, my work, what it does is examining and comparing some of these crisis networks. These images belong to two papers of mine, which were published a couple of years ago. The network to the left is belonging to the 2019 cyclones Idai and Kenneth in Mozambique, whereas the network to the right belongs to the 2010 Icelandic ash cloud crisis. I am adding a third case study, which is the actual 2014 to 2016 Ebola virus disease outbreak. And in this particular project, I also want to add the network of negotiations leading to financial assistance in Ukraine after the invasion of Russia in 2022. My more specific research questions are, what do these networks, if anything, have in common? And if we can find out any structural patterns that tend to be more present in networks that were more or less effective. And why do I do that? Well, focusing on networks allows me to have a wider look, as I was telling you, to relations. If we think about classic papers on political science or international relations, we could think of classic research questions such as the performance of a country over time or the behavior of a political leader during a specific conflict. But if we think about networks, and in network terms, we have a relational focus which already will help us ask questions that have not been asked before. For example, if we think about a particular crisis, we would start thinking about a particular actor such as the European Union in terms such as who did it coordinate with in the network, how well did the member states and Brussels coordinate among themselves, to what extent does this matter for an effective management of a crisis, or does the origin of the crisis matter for this? Now, I talked to you about network patterns, structural patterns. I will give you some brief examples of what I mean by this. We have here two images. The network to the left will be an example of fully centralized networks, where there is a node at the center which attracts the attention of all their peers. Whereas the network to the right will be the polar opposite. It's a network fully decentralized, much less hierarchical, much more horizontal. Well, all actors have access to the exact same number of network peers. For example, if we want to talk about the network to the left in real life, we could think about the management of China of COVID-19, where the national government monopolized all decision making. And if we want to talk about an example closer to the network to the right, we could think about the cases of Germany or Spain, where subnational levels had been delegated many more competencies. I will talk to you about another structural pattern that is relevant for this, which is that of density or interconnectedness. Well, the network with the nodes in yellow is highly interconnected, very dense, whereas the network with the nodes in blue will be much less interconnected. Now, we could think about what would we expect these networks to be in terms of effectiveness in crisis management. Well, on the one hand, the network that is the most centralized might be more efficient, but at the same time, it might be more vulnerable, because imagine what happens if the node to the center is disrupted. The entire flow of information will not work anymore. And intuitively, we would say that the network with the nodes in yellow will be much more efficient, since the onset of the crisis, all nodes will have access immediately to information from all the other nodes in the network. However, it might be the case that the network with the nodes in blue is much more efficient because many less exchanges are needed. And therefore, a response can be produced in much less time. Now, I will give you a sneak preview of some results. that I have already obtained. Indeed, it seems that all these very different crisis networks show some common patterns. To give you an example, interconnectedness levels will be rather similar. On a scale from 0 to 1, there will be, all networks will be between 0.38 and 0.5 in terms of interconnectedness. Centralization scores will also be quite similar. But here I have to say that beyond some level of centralization, this is correlated with less effectiveness. However, I want to stress that this is still a very young research project, so I hope in a few months I will be able to provide you with more results, of course. But to finish this presentation, I want to leave with a message, which is that systematic research on crisis networks is primarily aimed at helping improve political outcomes. In the first place, so that policymakers, when they have to make decisions and have no time to do it, know what works and what does not work in crisis management. But also, for you as citizens, to be able to know whether these decisions were correct or not, so that you're able to hold these policy leaders into account, perhaps in the next general election. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Carlos.
Hey, Yara from Tel Aviv University. Carlos, really interesting. I have a question. How much does the network change with a crisis? Meaning, if you could monitor emails of, this given, let's say, center or NGO, would that give you a sense of how robust the network is prior to crisis and being able to predict how well it will respond? Or is it something like completely uncorrelated how the networks evolve once a crisis hits?
Okay. Let me see if I understood the question. So you mean how the same network was operating before the crisis, the extent to which there was change with the... Okay. So I have to say that it's hard to talk in those terms because a crisis network is at times created or at least heavily modified for the sake of managing a specific crisis. So for example, and this is also another one of the findings of my project, very tentative as well, of course. If we think about the actors that are involved normally in policy making in, say, the air transportation sector, we will find many of these in the crisis, but because of the particularities of this Icelandic ash cloud crisis, there were actors that were incorporated because their input was needed. In this case, engine manufacturers, which normally will not belong. So it's hard to talk about how the networks change because they will have their own logic, which will start and end with the crisis itself.
Balthasar from Haifa. So thanks for the talk. I was just wondering, so you model networks as directed graphs, right? Like you have vertices and you have arrows. Okay, I was wondering, you said that the networks you looked at, they had all the pretty similar shape in these graph theoretic terms. But it seems to me, for instance, that like, of course, this is a very high level of abstraction and you will not be able to model certain differences. So it might be that when we speak about financial transactions, that all the agents transact pretty much the same amount or in the same ballpark, or it might be another situation in which there's one central agent who denotes a lot of money, like the EU or something, and many other agents which denote very little, like private agents also. And a question is, do you, for instance, there's a way of you might want to add a weight to the arrows, right, to account for these differences, because if you only look at it as a directed graph, you will not see, they will share the same structure, even though I would assume they behave quite differently. And one way of enriching the structure is to add weights to the arrows. Is that something you you intend looking into?
Thank you very much. So on the question of weights to the arrows, well, first of all, I have to say that the ties that I am looking at in the network correspond to communication among actors. And the weights would, indeed there are weights, but they will reflect how intense the communication was. So I don't know if you refer to weights by thickness of the ties, the higher yeah. So yes, there is weights, yes, in all these graphs. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Uven from the Technion. So I'm wondering, since you mentioned only a handful of cases that you are studying, you know, like statistically speaking, how possible it is to really make broad conclusions / decisions about what's the better way to conduct in a crisis, in the sense that 3 events have very different circumstances, a pandemic in Africa versus arms distribution in Europe, you know, the starting point's very different, the purpose very different. So I was just wondering how can you really justify your bottom line?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yes, we have to bear in mind that a big limitation of the study is the small sample of networks. One thing that we have to take into account is that collecting the data for these networks is very time consuming. It's quite expensive in resources. It's basically talking to all crisis managers in one particular incident, and this takes a lot of time. Therefore, over time, hopefully, this is just a starting point that will hopefully again get more robust. This is just a beginning. So at the moment we can talk about commonalities among these case studies, but of course we have to bear in mind that the sample is still very small. But this is at least what we have at the moment, so better than having nothing at all. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I actually had the same question, so I'm not sure how much it adds. So I'm Nadine, I'm from Tel Aviv University, and I also felt that the whole notion of your endeavor is based that you can model like your systems. And I was wondering how you operationalize like the connections. And so it goes in the same direction that I felt like how is communication operationalized? What is an indicator? Just to like have some kind of communication, because I also felt it could be different, and I also had the question about the weights, because thereby you can probably have other implications from it, and also the problem of comparison. I had the impression that you also want to compare different crisis networks, and taking into account the different indicators might help you to form like more detailed conclusions.
Mm-hmm. So how the indicators are operationalized, first of all, when it comes to communication, we ask the managers themselves to rate from 1 to 10 how intensely they were communicating or cooperating with other organizations. And again, the second question was about?
It went in the whole direction of operationalization of your model. Like how do you construct the model based on what information goes into it?
Yes, so yes, it's indeed the input from the crisis managers themselves. Yeah, it's of course subjective.
I'm a psychologist, so I don't...
Yeah.
I'm all about
Yeah, I mean, that's a problem with social sciences. We wish that... Yeah.
So I have a question, Maria, from the Weizmann Institute of Science. I'm coming back to the weight questions, because I was wondering, so how can you quantify communication? I mean, so do you use a single number? Those weights represent maybe a small equation there inside in which you include some factors? How? I mean, what? Because communication, what does it mean? An email, a meeting?
Yeah.
That's I cannot say it.
Everything. Yeah. How?
But do you make like a distribution?
No, questions were rather how often were you in touch with these bodies during the crisis, and how often did you monitor their actions, rated in a scale from 0 to 10, and then it was basically the average of both scores.
And have you seen some kind of distribution in the networks? Like in the sense that normally, well, I'm a physicist and I just want to know something. Normally what I see is normal distributions of all the time. Is it this behaving some?
I don't know, I haven't looked into that
Okay.
particularly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's
Thank
all
you.
we have time for. Thank you, Carlos.